I've introduced to you a reflective essay, and now I want to provide some additional thinking on how to go about doing this. This is probably an essay format that you've never done before, or very few of you probably have done it before. It is not just a process of kind of thinking through things and writing a personal narrative, although that's part of it. It also includes doing research, and there is a particular outcome that we're trying to accomplish here, which is using reflection to identify how we learn, how we have learned, how we continue to learn, and writing about it in this essay. And one way to go about this, which is described in your textbook, and you should, if you haven't yet, you should read the assigned pieces of the textbook. There's not a lot, it takes about 20-30 minutes to finish the reading, is this idea of what, so what, now what. So you start with identifying an experience, a movie, a book. I'll talk about some of these. I've actually chosen an experience, a movie, and also kind of a trip, a series of trips that I took to Washington, D.C. So, but it can be, there are a lot of things, and if you're not sure about whether something that you want to write about is appropriate, just drop me a note and we can talk about that. Describe it as objectively as you can, and then do a little analysis. Tell your reader go a little deeper into why it was significant to you, and then you're going to finish with how have you used that experience, or how can you use that experience going forward? What is it? Why is it impactful to you? What did you learn from it? How do you continue to use that learning? And kind of follow that approach to write this essay. Now, again, we go beyond just your personal views on it. You're going to support this with some additional research, which I'll describe here coming up. So I'm going to use some personal examples here, since they are familiar to me, to help you potentially identify how you might go forward. When I was 14, 15 years of age, in the early 70s, do the math, now you know how old I am. So there was a scandal in Washington, D.C. that we now refer to, and we referred to even in those days, as Watergate. And a lot of people don't know where that term Watergate came from. Well, it actually refers to this building, which is still there in Washington, next to the Potomac River. And it was referred to Watergate. And now, here, 40 years later, 50 years later, we often use something gate to refer to a scandal. Well, this all started with Watergate, and it's this building, which is apartments and offices next to the Potomac River. And the reason we refer to it as Watergate is the whole thing started with a break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters that were based there at Watergate. This was a profound moment for me, and it became more so because I have visited Washington, D.C. quite a few times in my life, starting when I was 9 years old. My father worked for the federal government at that time, and I actually visited the White House with him when I was very young. And so Washington, D.C. has been kind of an important place for me. But years later, when I would go back as an adult and after Watergate, I would seek out that building just to kind of put it in some kind of perspective. But I also came to really love Washington, not as a political place so much, but it is an amazing place for just learning about history and art. The museums, particularly the Smithsonian museums, but other museums that are kind of surrounding the mall area there. It's not a shopping center, it's the area that runs from the Lincoln Memorial back up to the state or the U.S. Capitol. That area is surrounded by national museums, all of which are free, and it's an amazing, you can just spend day after day after day. So Washington has always had a profound place for me, and so might be one thing that I would do a reflective essay on the impact of Washington and how it's changed my perceptions, or whatever. I would then go from there. Here's what I want to show you is that telling that story and using and telling it in the fashion that I discussed in the first slide isn't quite enough. You need to then go further, and so I've added here a couple of one scholarly reference and one credible reference. The scholarly reference happens to be a paper in a journal, a scholarly journal called Litigation, co-written by John Dean, and John Dean was the White House counsel at the time of Watergate, and he got in big trouble. He was convicted of a crime. He has since been a huge critic of everything that happened there, including his own behavior, and including writing this paper, which came many years after Watergate. Also, to help support what I might write about my visits to the Smithsonian is a credible source, which is the Smithsonian's own website that explains its history. So that's one option that I might consider if I were doing this. Here's another option that you might think about, and I'm again using a personal example. So in 1979, a movie came out called Apocalypse Now, and I saw it shortly after it came out, but I kind of set it aside. Very dark movie, but beautifully written and acted. Years later, probably in the maybe 86, 87, I rented the movie. This was back in the VHS days, and it was the long kind of editor's cut, director's cut. So it had all of the scenes that had not been in the initial, and it ran something like 3.5 hours. And one day I just sat down and I watched it, and I was so stunned by this movie that I remember very distinctly when the movie was over, I couldn't move. I couldn't get out of my chair. I just sort of sat there, and it must have been 15, 20 minutes where I just sat there kind of processing what I had just seen because it was so startling and powerful. And of course, it was about the Vietnam War, but it was obviously a fictionalized story, but it was the telling of a journey by some soldiers in the war, and it had a lot of certainly historically based information, but it was a fictional story. At any rate, it was very powerful to me, and it caused me to want to learn more about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was going on when I was growing up. I still remember when I was in elementary school, one friend in particular had a brother in Vietnam, and he would occasionally bring photographs to school of things that his brother had taken pictures of in Vietnam, and they were gruesome. I mean, they were, bodies, and it was just horrific. But I remember every evening watching the evening news. Back in those days, there were only 3 networks, and they all had an evening news program, and they would basically recount what had happened most recently in Vietnam that day, and body counts and death counts and all the terrible stuff. It wasn't until much later that I actually, as a history student in college, when I went back and learned more about the details of Vietnam, and this movie caused me to want to learn. Basically, I challenged myself, how much of this could have been true? What's the background here? And so it became a very powerful movie for me that I never forgot, and it changed me in a very profound way. that's another opportunity here to write about something like this as your essay. I have noted down here a citation from a scholarly journal about the long-term effects of war on civil engagement, and parts of that paper refer to Vietnam specifically. And so again, we want to go from this personal narrative into additional research to help you apply it and make it more useful and more help you reflect on your vision and your experience with it. So here's my final example, again, from my own life. So I began covering news as a newspaper reporter, first as what we called a city site, or a news reporter, and for about a year after that, I was asked to go over into the sports department. That's where I'd gotten my start writing part-time when I was still in high school, to help revamp the sports section at the newspaper. This was at the newspaper in Provo, Utah at the time. So, and it's still there. But I recall one moment specifically when I went out and did a story, and I covered a football game. And during that football game, the coach for the visiting team, whom I did not know, kind of lost his mind at one point in the game and actually got 3 consecutive unsportsmanlike conduct penalties against his team, which moved them back 45 yards, and he was kicked out of the game. So the next Monday or so, I wrote a column about that, about how terrible it was, and I talked about the coach and how that had gone. When at the morning after that story came out, I got a call from the high school, which was in Salt Lake, telling me that they didn't deny that had happened, but I'd gotten the name of the coach wrong. I had assumed it was the head coach who had done that. It turned out it was an assistant coach, and I had used the wrong name throughout. I was utterly devastated. I essentially quit. I called my boss and said, I quit. I'm so embarrassed by this. Well, he was great. And he said, first of all, you're not going to quit. And second of all, we're going to talk about how you're going to learn from this. And there were a lot of things to learn. And fortunately, it was early in my career. I went on to be a journalist full-time for another 35 years, including 22 years as publisher of several newspapers. But I never forgot that moment, and I applied it over and over and over again. And I told that story to young journalists that I worked with. And so again, that was a powerful moment. I wanted to go beyond that for the purposes of talking to you about this assignment. So here's some research in a peer-reviewed journal about how we become resilient by overcoming difficult experiences. That's again how we want to apply research to the personal narrative here. So those are 3 examples. They are not intended to be complete or comprehensive. There are a lot of other ways to go about this. You do need to make it a personal moment, a personal experience, a personal thing of some kind, and you need to then attach to that additional research and then write it in a personal but a scholarly way. And there is more information on how to do that in the book, and we're going to talk about that more in class. But those are some ideas for you on how you might go about this.